On behalf of the Professional Baseball Strength and Conditioning Coaches Society, I'd like to welcome you to the PBSCCS Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Messina. Today's episode is going to be another group episode. I'm going to have the guys introduce themselves, just first name, last name, org, position, whatever you guys want to throw out there that's relevant, and then we'll get into it. So we'll go Taylor, Connor, and then Logan, and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Chris. My name is Taylor Haslinger. I am the Gulf Coast League Strength and Conditioning Coach with the Toronto Blue Jays organization.
What up, guys? Connor Derrickson. I am the minor league rehab strength conditioning coach for the Minnesota Twins.
And Logan Jones. I'm in my fourth season with the Arizona Diamondbacks. I'll be in the Low A California League with the Visalia Rawhide upcoming 2021 season.
That's why you were wearing the shirt. Okay, I got it. All right, guys. So this episode, I want to discuss arm care with you guys. Obviously, we're all in baseball. It's kind of a big topic in baseball, and people have different definitions and things like that for arm care. So I'm going to kick it off really, really broad, really generic, maybe too generic, and then we'll get into the rabbit hole. But first question for you guys is, do you have a separate arm care protocol within your system, or do you just consider your overall training program to be enough to cover your arm care needs?
Taylor, hit it off, brother. I know you got something churning in there.
Yeah, we have an additional arm care system that is delivered primarily by our athletic training staff, similar to the overall assessment process with the athletes when you're looking at it from upper body core to lower body profile, whether it's a single leg issue, a core issue, quote unquote, or even return to play with Connor's scenario. Those are all considerations in the process. For example, it's kind of like a lettered and numbered system. So 1A, 1B, 1C, with a variety of options. So from an open versus closed chain perspective, quote unquote intensive to extensive, body blade to manual therapy or whatever is in the routine, and obviously an athlete's preference. We definitely take into account obviously the schedule and the demands, mostly with our pitching staff, but we have also assigned it to catchers here or there, and position players accordingly.
For me, it's like such a broad question, right? Like in so many, I guess you could say teams or people could take it multiple different ways, right? Like it could be strength and conditioning handles the arm care, skill coaches handle the arm care, sports medicine handles arm care, or is it like a combination, right? Does everybody handle bits and pieces of the arm care? It's hard, right? Like what can you even categorize arm care, right? Like what technically is arm care? Is it like just working the singular joint, right? Like is it just working the shoulder and working the arm, or is it the holistic approach, right? Because I don't think there's any singular way to like define movement. So I think it comes down to the individual, right? Like maybe somebody's best arm care is fixing spinal dysfunction or rib positioning, right? Because maybe that's the root of their whatever. Maybe they have arm pain or anything, the root of their injury or whatever. So I think it definitely comes down to like an individual approach, as well as who's going to take the lead in that aspect. But training, I think, is, I think you can get a lot of good arm care through quality training and quality movement, right? Like, as well as I think a separate approach to that, right? Like I think a lot of the sports medicine side will do separate stuff as well. So kind of beating around the answer there, I think it's a very broad approach to it all.
Yeah, Taylor, Connor, building off of what you guys mentioned, I completely agree. I think that first and foremost, I think that starting with just a foundational understanding of anatomy and basic posture. And when I think of posture, I think position and function. And, that leads to movement. And then we look at the demand of the sport, the demand of throwing a baseball. And I think that if you can understand these foundational concepts, these foundational pieces, everything is built kind of there. That's the foundation of the house, if you will. And as you guys alluded to, I think that arm care is total body care and total body care is arm care. I think that they're probably one and the same. We do, with the Arizona Diamondbacks, have a separate arm care protocol. I would imagine that that's relatively standard issue across the board. I think that in season, out of season demands of travel and those types of things play a factor. And we can certainly check the arm care boxes, if you will, organically in a training program. But I also think that there are many pros to having a standalone program, whether it's through building a routine with the younger guys in the minor leagues or taking into consideration training age and what position do they play? How do we handle our position players versus our pitchers? And if you're a starter versus reliever, what are the goals of the players? And honestly, I think it boils down to intent. That's the big thing that pops in my mind is, are we intentful with our training program to the extent of we are hitting whatever we consider to be our necessary guiding principles or methodologies in our training program? And if we are, maybe we don't need a program. But if we aren't, then maybe we need to supplement that with something towards the end of a lift or as part of a warm-up, whatever it may be. So as you guys alluded to, I completely agree. It's highly dependent on the guy, and I'm not sure that there's any right or wrong here. It's not black or white. It's whatever we find to work best with our population that we're working with here.
Yeah, and I completely agree there. Like, I think the most bastardized approach was back, I guess probably predating us and pro ball, was doing 15 or 10 exercises haphazardly, right? Like instead of picking 2, 3, 4 exercises that are good and doing them really, really, really well. So speaking on intent, yeah.
Yeah, my 2 things for the notes that I had, and I purposely kicked it off broad because I was interested to see what you guys said. But for me, is defining arm care, like Connor had brought up, is like it's such a broad category. Is like, is it injury prevention? Is it, post throwing? Is it pre-lift? Like there's so many ways that you can go with arm care. And for me, like you guys said, like if I'm in a lifting program and I'm doing a heavy row and I'm, controlling my eccentric on the row, is that better for arm care versus me just taking a band and just kind of doing some eye wash things like this? Like, yeah. So there's, the definition is different for everybody. And again, I think the intent is the important thing. And then the other thing for me, and I think Logan, you had just mentioned, is like age is a big factor for me that I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. Like, is an arm care program the same for a 15-year-old high school baseball player versus a first-year Latin player in the GCL or the AZL versus a 30-year-old, 5-10-year major league vet? Like, does that age factor play in? And maybe what other factors do you look at to distinguish specific things that you do for arm care? Is there like a set, okay, this is kind of our routine, but we can modify that accordingly? Or is it just, it's an absolute, not necessarily free for all, but like there's just so much gray that you need to figure that out. So I'm curious on your guys' thoughts on, we kind of already touched on the definition aspect, but does age play into you to how you program arm care, quote unquote?
That's a good question. I think that we took this really good broad view in that maybe traditional arm care is viewed as a singular input, typically probably post-throwing with most organizations. I think something that personally the Blue Jays and we're learning and developing really well is the overall inputs, right, of the arm. So we're talking about J-band warm-up. We want to get into the discussion of plyo ball warm-up. Will that suffice for an older player versus someone who you have to maybe educate and expose more? No different than anything else within the system, whether it's strength conditioning principles, understanding where we go in the building. So maybe a little bit more of the slow cook approach for our younger guys, at least for the ones I've been around, and putting them a lot with a position of a position to be successful. We had a few guys once try to shadow box with the 1 pound pink dumbbells. and so things can get carried away. And does that really maybe cause any true harm? Probably not, but not necessarily the habit or the routine we're looking for.
Yeah, like going back to like what is arm care again, like to me, and maybe that's just the current position in which I'm in right now, like maybe that changes my point of view, but it's almost injury management / prevention, right? Like why are they getting injured in the first place? Why did, like, if we're going to talk strictly UCL or let's talk strictly UCL, like why are they here in the first place? What were they doing before this? Do we have enough data on everything that they did so that we can track and understand what got us to this instance and how are we going to progress from that? So like, it might not be J-bands and end range ERs or whatever it is, but I think having that data in the beginning and after can hopefully give us a better picture on where to go and where to take arm care somewhat in the future. And then like the age difference, like, yeah, that's a tough one. Like, I feel like a lot of us all have our staples. Like I personally have like my staples that I kind of non-negotiables that I want to do in arm care and I think are necessary for most levels of play and ages. But like, I think getting a 12-year-old boy being able to do a pretty good push-up and gain some basic strength and be able to maybe row his body weight will be some pretty sufficient arm care there in itself, instead of him being 125-pound twig. You know what I mean? I think that would be extremely beneficial. And I think that would probably be the lowest hanging fruit at that time, right? Like, let's put some muscle on you, brother.
Yeah, great stuff from you guys right there. And I think that my thoughts are, I'm incredibly biased for sure, because I spent the first 2 years with the D-backs in the AZL with your first year Latin guy in the States or your guys out of the high school or the draft. And I'm just thinking for sure age plays at least somewhat of a factor for me. I think maybe the more experience you have, the more autonomy. For those first year guys in the AZL, it's a educational piece. It's a development of a routine tool. I think that you can spin it probably any way. I mean, certain demands of the game don't necessarily change. The demands of playing the sport of baseball or throwing a baseball, it may be done at a higher frequency or the total volume may be higher up you go. And as you get into a full season and eventually making the jump to the big leagues, like the volume picks up again, even more from that standpoint. But I think if you're looking at the demands, they stay relatively similar, but for sure, I mean, biological age and training age, both of those to me play a factor just from a standpoint, and it may help to guide us in a specific direction that's specific or that's beneficial rather for an individual, as opposed to maybe throwing out a shotgun approach like standard issue. Here's your arm care program on a piece of paper, may not be as beneficial in all cases. But I think for the younger guys, the education aspect of it and teaching the importance of why it is that we do this. It's not for us, it's for you, and keeping you on the field. And we don't want you to have a successful career at the lower levels of the minor leagues. We want you to have a successful career in the big leagues one day. So keep it in perspective certainly helps too.
Yeah, with me, I just saw actually on Instagram earlier, one of my mentors had a post and it was like, arm care, it's funny that it popped up before this podcast, but arm care is holistic. And in my mind, the idea of arm care is the injury prevention aspect, right? Like, we do this because we don't want you to get hurt when you play. Well, if that's the case, there's a lot of factors in injury, right? It's like, what was your throwing volume? How much have you run this week? How much have you slept? What you're eating? Like, there's so many factors into getting injured that if we're trying to minimize the risk of injury, maybe doing extra exercises of, manuals or band work or dumbbell work might actually be putting you closer to injury because you're already in a fatigue state. Like, we have to play all of those factors in. And so obviously, like, we call arm care, a certain amount of exercises, and we're going to talk here moving forward about certain exercises that we like or don't like. But I think it needs to be hit on that overall, generally speaking. Like, if you define arm care as trying to minimize the risk of injury, it's going to come from a holistic approach of looking at volumes, looking at overall training, looking at nutrition. All of those factors play into it. And even like to Connor's point earlier is like, my arm might be hurting when I throw, but it might be because I'm restricted in my hip. So if I'm cleaning up my hip and now it cleans up my arm, well, I minimize my risk of injury in my arm. So technically that was arm care, but I was doing hip exercises. And I think some people have trouble connecting that, and especially younger kids. Like I see, you know, high school strength coaches and high school baseball players. My brother's a high school baseball player. So it's like, oh, what exercises can I do to make my scaps really, really strong? Like,
Yeah.
well,
Your bone scap.
Yeah. Like, okay, first of all, take a step back here, brother. Let's one at a time. And then, like, you know, like Connor said, like, can you do a push-up? Like, send me a video of you doing a push-up. Like, no. Okay, well, let me tell you something. If you clean that push-up up, I guarantee you're going to throw harder. You're going to be healthier. All this, like, you have to. That's why for me, like, the age thing does play in. Is I can get a young kid to do, you know, 7 exercises with bands, but if that kid can't do a push-up for me, or, you know, an inverted row, a TRX row, like, why don't I just pound those? And even honestly, like, you'll see it in pro ball. There are guys that are a little bit older who don't have a huge base of strength training. And I know I'm picking on 12 to 15-year-olds, but I've been around guys that are in their 20s that can't do a solid push-up. And it's like, if you just clean that up, like, I guarantee you'll be better. So that's just my 2 cents on it. And I don't know if you guys want to throw anything else in there, but I think we need to make it known that, at least for me, it's more of a whole holistic thing with arm care instead of just a certain amount of exercises.
Yeah, just like you and Logan both said, I think like the education piece is huge, right? Like, because like you said, most younger athletes and younger kids, they don't understand, right? Like they want to throw hard. So my arm throws the ball. So I got to do some arm care. It's just the education piece of, you know, kind of connecting the chain.
Yeah. So let's go down this rabbit hole of exercises. So assuming that we've looked at everything else, and now we're going to pick some exercise that we think guys are going to get their big bang for their buck. They're strong, they're healthy, they're well-maintained with their eating and all of that stuff. What exercises do you think you guys must have in your program? And conversely, are there any exercises that you want to avoid at all costs with your quote-unquote arm care program?
Yeah, Connor and I are a little biased because we went to the Weber International coaching tree, and my coordinator, my boss, Steve Rousel, definitely exposed us to the joint-by-joint approach. His wife, Dr. Brittany Rousel, definitely had us learn very frequently in our education curriculum there the importance, at least for the shoulder complex and the upper extremity. I think for any baseball strength coach, the importance of that area with the serratus anterior and the lower trap and how everything kind of force couples in that direction, and keeping the ball in the socket, right? Keeping the ball in the socket has become really important. Personally, just with the population I work with, most closed-chained exercises for the upper rotation of the scap due to the serratus seem to go well rather than open chain, whether it's using that timeward retention and the highlight of importance. I know Connor, I think, just made a recent content post of some of these things as well. I don't think those can be understated as far as what we're going back to here is what is overused and what is not used enough.
Yeah, and for me, like, not trying to beat around the bush again, but it comes down to, like, once again, the individual. Like, okay, first off, like, there is going to be staples, like I said, and I'll get into that, but like, how was the ex-athlete presenting, right? Is he flat T-spine? Is he whatever? You know what I mean? Like, scaps depressed. Does he everything else depressed, or is he elevated? Like, what does he need? But outside of that, I think I'm not necessarily married to any exercises, but more or less, I guess you could say, principles. First off, like, I think we got to get the cuff strong, right? Like, I think in the past we haven't done well at getting the cuff strong, and I think like that's a big thing, is getting the cuff strong. Like, whether that's your in ranges, your liftoffs, your manuals, all that kind of stuff. And then I think there's somewhat of a timing component to it, whether that's your staves or anything timing, right? Like turning off, turning on. I guess obviously we all know you can't turn off and turn on, but the shoulder is very reflexive in nature, and that timing aspect is big. And then thirdly, like the active versus passive, looking at like obviously doing in-range work correctly, like how much ER do we have passively, how much do we have actively, and can we shorten that? Can we minimize that? So get it strong, the timing aspect, and minimizing active versus passive. But I mean, when in doubt, right? Like 9 times out of 10, like most guys are going to present with like some anterior tilt, right? Like most guys are going to need some posterior tilt of the scaps. Most guys are going to need more serratus work because they can't upwardly rotate well. And those are the two that I see the most, right? Like,
Yeah, I think it's a good point that there's probably no end all be all, right? Just like any other
yeah.
kind of strength conditioning, it's like what type of squat do you want? But maybe the principles, or at least the general thought process, I think needs to be there for sure.
Yeah. And like I said, 9 times out of 10, like not just in baseball, but in overhead athletes, right? They most need more serratus work. We're stuck in this, what is this? Upper cross syndrome. I couldn't even think of it. We're stuck in that. Like we're internally rotated at the humerus. We need to be able to posteriorly tilt the scaps a lot better.
Yeah, you guys, you've shared some.
Sorry, keep going last, Logan. That kind of sucks.
No, dude. Look, I'm just sitting here. I'm sitting back. I'm learning from you guys. Like I think this is happening organically here. So, and thinking of ways that I can be a little bit different. I mean, maybe I have a little bit of an unpopular opinion. I don't know that I have any must-have exercises when we're looking at an exercise selection standpoint. Instead, I think that maybe guiding principles with numerous exercises, like think of an exercise menu the same way that we would. And when we're going through a needs analysis in the weight room from a standard issue weight training program, I think a similar process can be developed for an arm care, whether it's specific to the shoulder and the scap, the elbow, the forearm, the wrist and hand, whatever it is. And I think that, and we may prioritize those areas. And I think that for sure, stability is equally as important as strength, right? So that's your rhythmic staves, Connor, that you touched on. And I think also like mobility, maybe some of the FRC concepts of cars and pails and rails when they're appropriate. They're certainly not always appropriate. And I think that's probably another rabbit hole potentially that we could dive down. But ultimately, I think our means of achieving these, so like the way that we choose to resist these exercises and the actual exercise selection themselves are endless. I think that we can be creative in what we ask guys to do. So from a resistance standpoint, that may be bands, it may be ISOs, holding lighter dumbbells, it might be manual resistance, it may be your rhythmic stabilizations. And then another aspect of it to me that we haven't talked on yet is adjusting body position. So are the guys laying down on their back supine? Are they in a quad all fours position? Are they kneeling, half kneeling, standing? Split stance may be the most, advanced or I don't like using the word sport specificity because I'm not sure that too much we do in the weight room looks like throwing a baseball or swinging a bat.
Yeah.
I do think that getting in these positions can encourage maybe some carryover there. But if we're talking, Chris, if we're talking exercise selection, I mean, I think your standard issue Y's, T's, A's, rows to ER, IR, ER of the shoulder, Taylor keeping the joint centrated. Like I think that maybe I prefer to speak in guiding principles as opposed to black or white exercise selection, just because I feel like we can get I feel like we can get in a little bit of trouble. And Connor, you've talked on the posture and the position. To me, that's key. And I boil it down to where is the pelvis, where are the ribs, where is the head and the neck. And then from there, it's all about the setup and execution. And again, it kind of is about the intent. And if we can get them in an advantageous position, now we coach them up a little bit, educate them, and now we can make some real leeway in our goals and raise the level of expectation and execution of these simplistic exercises.
Yeah, I think the stance point that you made was great, and none of us said that yet. Like, I think that's a really good point of like, are we going to start them in a split stance or are we going to start them in half kneeling, right? Like, my 18-year-old Dominican kid is probably going to be doing something different, right? Like, and they're going to start in different areas and progress to different areas, as well as like, I think it's important the order in which these are performed too, right? Like, are we doing rhythmic stabilizations or a timing piece on the cuff before we're doing any scap on rib, right? Like, are we addressing rib positioning first before we do timing issues, right? Like I think that's really important and needs to be talked about as well.
For me, I'm always hesitant to give specific exercise recommendations because people will run with it. Yeah. Oh, this guy said I need to do Y's, T's, A's, so I'm going to just destroy my arms with those. I'm going to do 100. If he said do 15, I'm going to do 30. If he says do them 1 time a day, I'm going to do them 3 times a day because it's going to get my scaps strong again. And you're like, okay, again with the scaps, like calm down. We need to have a conversation about this first. And that, again, we go back to educating guys. So I don't think there's any specific exercise that cover the whole broad spectrum of baseball players. Like we've talked about, like if a guy can't do a push-up in a row, for me, like do those first. If you can do those, okay, then maybe we start doing these other things. But the big thing for me, and we hit on it with our last point, is just the intent aspect of it. Is if I give you an exercise, it doesn't matter if it really is a great exercise or not if you're not executing it properly. If it looks like shit, if your ribs are flared, if you're just, looking around the gym while you're doing some of these, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like the intent for me plays a way bigger role than just what the specific exercise is. And I agree with you guys. I think there are certain things that we can do in terms of exercises, but I don't want to be like, oh yeah, you must do this. And then, my 18-year-old brother sends me a video and he's like, is this good? And I'm like, oh my God, like it's not even close to what I want, bro. Like slow it down a little bit. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm with you guys. I don't think there's anything that's a must have. And I mean, for me, I don't think there's anything that's off limits either. I know even like a bench press versus push up debate can probably be had here. And I'm actually going to have a podcast about that coming out at some point in the future. I'm trying to get some people who are brave enough to come on and chop it up about that. And you can talk scaps moving and things like that with that. But I don't think there's anything that's super, I will never do this. And there's nothing that I'm like, I must have. Like, it's just way too individualized on the person I have in front of me. And I'm not a big fan of just giving generic recommendations for things. And you guys can motherfuck me if you think I'm wrong, but that's just kind of where I'm at in my current life. That could change. I reserve the right to change my mind. You know what I mean? But I think right now it's way too individualized. Even in pro ball, just the amount of difference we have in, one guy throws sidearm and he's 18. One guy throws over the top and he's, 35. One guy's 100 from, I got a guy that was at the alt site with me. He's 100 sidearm. Like his arm care program probably is going to be different than the lefty who's over the top throwing 86 and dotting up. Like, yeah. So I that's just where I'm at with that. I don't know how you guys feel, but
that's actually kind of an idea of this whole group. I'm talking about it, right? Like the posture, how structure dictates function. Is we haven't even really touched on that subject yet, Chris, of how does the athlete actually even perform the sport itself, right? Is he more east-west, more side-to-side, or over the top? Going into the holistic approach, right, of the spine and the core of the other topics we had, and the amount of lateral lean that requires, right? I think it was, not to plug them too much, but you and I went to the On Base U, and they just had that post, right, of just bending over and flexing and extending your T-spine relative to the amount of external rotation you have. I think that's a very interesting topic of considering what does the pitching coach or the player development side see that maybe is causing an issue, or maybe things that are going right at the same time.
Yeah, right on. So do you guys have any resources to find more on arm care? Like where are you going to read up on, whether it's anatomy purposes or training purposes? Just where are you guys going to find more that will help you when you get back to your athletes?
Logan, go ahead and go first.
Yeah, lead us off on this one, Logan. We'll let you hit first on this one.
Okay, sounds good. I'm thinking if you want a super deep dive here on anatomy, Anatomy Trains is a good place to start.
Yeah.
Understanding that it helps to have a baseline understanding of maybe your standard issue undergraduate. Hope you paid attention in anatomy and physiology 1 and 2 type deal. If not, it may be a little over the top for you. If that's the case, no problem. I think that YouTube obviously is a free option. There's a lot of good content. There's also a lot of terrible content on YouTube. So you have to know where to look and maybe who those individuals are that push out the better content. I think if we're talking specific to shoulder scap, elbow, I think Eric Cressy's Sturdy Shoulders course is a phenomenal resource. I think Cressy and maybe Reinold came out with the functional stability training. They have an upper lower core and maybe optimizing movement. That's going to be more of a holistic approach, understanding how the lower half, the upper half connects and works together, and maybe understanding a little bit about posture as well. And with the Diamond, we're huge into PRI, Postural Restoration Institute. That's certainly not specific to arm care by any means. It's more geared towards understanding respiratory mechanics and how that drives posture and function, and how maybe an excessive anterior tilt affects maybe how the rib cage is sitting, and that's going to affect how the scap's sitting on the ribs, and so on. And the orientation of we get down a rabbit hole pretty quickly here with all that. And honestly, I think that feel free to reach out to any of us. I know I'm speaking for the group here, but I think we can provide additional resources and content upon request. And I know at least myself here, like I'm eager to assist in any way possible, and anybody that has any questions or anything along those lines, because so many people have helped to get me to where I am today. And the least that I can do, I feel an obligation to kind of flip that around and share not only things that have been successful for me, but maybe some places where I've made mistakes and learned from those mistakes. So just quickly, I'll give you a rundown here. Just YouTube, Cressy is always a phenomenal resource. Mike Reinold puts out some great information, and then a solid place to start for anatomy trains, and then PRI, Postural Restoration Institute, if you're at all interested about maybe the underlying mechanisms or causes of maybe some of the way that these guys present.
Yeah, Logan, I mean, you kind of hit a lot of the big nuggets there. I think a great starting place for most novice people would probably be like EC. Cressy's got so much stuff out there, right? And I think he puts it in a great format for people to understand, right? Like, he not necessarily dumbs it down, but he makes it extremely understandable. Same with Mike, right? Mike Reinold does a great job in that aspect. Maybe another one that you didn't touch on, like Driveline. I think Driveline is pretty trustworthy and puts out some pretty good content. And just like, I think a big point is to be careful with all the content that is out there, because it is so much that is out there, and sifting through it all is just as time consuming as finding the good stuff. So I think to Logan's point was, feel free to reach out to us. I try to put content out on social media, on Instagram every day. I like to do that, and I enjoy helping people. So feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, be careful where you get your information from, because there is so much of it out there.
Yeah, definitely similar to what Connor said. Filter the noise. Most recently, I think it just is really recent in my memory, is the Stan Conti presentations that I think are still available on his website, that were just very well-rounded from medical and a performance perspective on different topics related to arm care. Personally, Chris Zach at TCU, and the content he puts out, I think familiar path among all these people is you trust the source, and like Connor mentioned, someone who knows someone.
Yeah.
Joey Burglas, he's a great guy. He uses a lot of the FRC principles and shares a lot of his content on social media, similar to Vernon Griffith, I think, at Virginia High Performance, where he does a lot of things with mobility and the strength realm that I think are different and unique, but at the same time still worth the content and quality that are very applicable. So those are some guys off the top of my head.
Logan, do you want to go again, since you've been just, taking us home on all these questions? Have they brought any additional things for you?
Nope, got it all out.
Just piggybacking off everything. I love it. No.
Hey, I tell you what, man, I find it just as valuable, probably more valuable, to just, I could sit here in this 4-man group right here and not say a damn word, and I would
For
learn
sure.
more than I would if I just rambled off my biases of things that I like and don't like or whatever. So I love pulling up the rear, right? Save the best for last. At least I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean that's what I'm thinking right now. So I don't.
That's why I love these group podcasts. I told you guys off camera. It's just very organic. You just bounce ideas off of each other, and you just let them flow. And for me, I just sit back. I take my notes and put my 2 cents in, and then we just keep it rolling. So I want final thoughts from you guys. If people have not been paying attention during this podcast, just what big points do you want to hammer home here before we close this thing down? Logan, kick us off again. Oh, no. Okay. All right, Connor, go for it.
I'll kick it off. Not many times do people just catch the end of podcasts. Usually on mine, they just catch the first 5 minutes and then get out, but we'll see. I mean, arm care, like for me, like get it strong. There's usually a timing aspect, so train it timing wise and look at active versus passive range of motion there. Most of the time, 9 times out of 10, most people are going to need more serratus work and posterior tilt of the scapula. Arm care is, to me, a holistic approach, not a singular movement or a singular entity. So look outside of the shoulder, look at the trunk, and look at the other extremities first. And good content, Cressy, Driveline, Reinhold, PRI is great. If you kind of want like a dumbed down PRI, maybe like movement impairment syndromes, Shirley Sauerman book. Let's kick it off someone else.
I'll go next and leave Logan last. It's just a drop in the bucket for me. I think we talked on some good details here or there, but at the end of the day, it's a small input from the athlete's whole perspective, whether it's the throwing, whether it's the warm-up, whether it's the cool-down. And then if you think of the Bondarchuk pyramid of competitive to the most general things an athlete does in the day, it's one piece of the pyramid. And the holistic approach is something I think this group really, really accepts and embraces that challenge of the arm care progression and how to meet the athlete where they are.
Yeah, great stuff, guys. The biggest thing I take away is it's not as black and white as maybe we would like for it to be. I for sure think it's a holistic approach, and maybe I mentioned it earlier, I can't remember, but I think that arm care is total body care. I think that that's not a stretch of the imagination, and conversely, total body care is arm care as well. Understanding that, the ball's released from the hand, but that doesn't mean that arm care only encapsulates the shoulder, scap, elbow, forearm, wrist, and hand. And for me, maybe it's just because I'm a super simplistic and an idiot in a lot of cases, so I have to take things down to the most foundational basic level. But I like to start there, understanding anatomy. If you can understand points of attachments of muscles and their muscle action, probably going to understand maybe a little bit better posture and position. And then from there, you can start to understand function and maybe more specialized movement that is a pitching motion, or that is a infielder fielding ground ball and throwing it to first base. I think that's the foundation for it. And I'm just super fortunate to be a part of this group here. And I think that our values and our opinions align in a lot of senses. And I think that that's probably a testament to not only the environments that we work in, but the athletes that we've had an opportunity to work with. And I really appreciate you guys and the content and the thoughts and opinions you guys shared. And Chris, thanks so much for inviting us on. I've really enjoyed it.
Guys, I appreciate you coming on. I'll be in touch with all of you soon. Stay safe, and whenever the season starts, good luck to all of you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Take care, boy.
All right, everybody, that concludes our episode with Connor, Taylor, and Logan. I hope you enjoyed this one. This is a really good group of young but intelligent strength coaches, and I'm super fortunate that they all came on and were very open and were very willing to share all of their thoughts. 3 things that I took from the guys in this episode: arm care is a holistic approach. Start with basic anatomy and work from there. and exercise intent may be more important than exercise selection. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you again on the next one.